Studies and PhD in Biblical Studies from the University of Chicago. Edelman is the author of The Origins of the Second Temple, Persian Imperial Policies, and the Rebuilding of Jerusalem from 2005. And King Saul in the Historiography of Judah from 1991, as well as co-author, editor, and co-editor of many more. Thank you. Please.
I would like to thank the organizers and sponsors for inviting me to participate in this rather interesting workshop. It's been very wonderful. I've learned quite a lot, and God in particular, with all of the back and forth, and I was not always as responsive as I should have been. Okay, Yahweh Shomron and Yahweh Elohim in the Achaemenid province of Samaria. Better put the glasses on. Okay. The discovery of what is commonly considered the earliest phase of the Sumerian temple, dedicated to Yahweh on Mount Gerizim, dated by the excavators to the first half of the 5th century BCE, has led to a number of suggestions about why it was located there specifically. Less discussion has taken place about which manifestation of Yahweh was worshipped there via a sacrificial cult, which is an equally important issue. Was this a satellite sanctuary for the main deity of the city of Samaria, Yahweh Shomron, or was it dedicated to Yahweh Elohim or Yahweh Ha-Elohim, a newly emergent concept of divinity that embraced a henotheistic philosophy? The sanctuary on Gerizim would have operated in the same time period as the long-established sanctuary that must have existed in the former royal seat of the Kingdom of Israel, and which undoubtedly continued in use under the Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian provincial administrations. It would only have been terminated when Alexander destroyed the city of Samaria in 331 BC, after his appointed commander Andromachus was murdered there. Yet, the Pentateuch only appears to have served as a set of eventually authoritative sacred writings for those associated with the cult of the deity located on Mount Gerizim. And it shared the Pentateuch with the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem in the adjoining province of Yhwh, rather than with the temple for Yahweh Shomron in Samaria. The ensuing investigation will take place in 3 sections. In the first, I will establish the existence of discrete forms of conceptualization for the deity Yahweh. In the second, I will review the archaeological findings from excavations conducted at Mount Gerizim and Shechem in the Persian period, as well as give you some brief survey data, and consider if the temple on Gerizim had already been built in the late Iron Age, as has recently been proposed. Finally, out of a larger pool of possibilities, I will evaluate the possible involvement of Sanballat, the Achaemenid appointed governor of Samaria, in the founding of the Persian-era sacred complex on Mount Gerizim. So we will begin with forms of Yahweh. Both the Hebrew Bible and archaeological evidence has confirmed that the deity known as Yahweh had different conceptual and manifest forms in different regions and cities. So in the former, in the Hebrew Bible, we have Yahweh Tzevaot, Yahweh Elohim, or Yahweh Ha-Elohim, Yahweh Elohei Yisrael, and Yahweh Elohei Tzevaot. In the Kingdom of Israel, this deity was represented at the sanctuaries of Dan and Bethel, allegedly, by its attribute animal, the bull, which could represent either an El-type deity or a Baal-type deity. In the south, or at least in Jerusalem, it was represented by an enthroned male figure indicated by the epithet cherubim sitter, and the 2 prophetic visions in Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 1 and 10, which also feature the same seated figure. This is a typical representation for an Ale-type figure. Inscriptional evidence adds additional forms, titles, and attributes of Yahweh. At Quintilet Ajrud, Yahweh Shomron and Yahweh of the south, Yahweh Hateman, are called upon for blessings and protection alongside their respective female partners, Asherah. An inscribed large stone basin there mentions blessings to or from the deity Yhwh, Yod He Vav, without the final He. We've had a lot of discussion now of this kind of phenomenon, so I fortunately won't have to go back into it. The relative dating provided by the pottery and carbon-14 dates in conjunction with paleographic considerations has been set from 830 to 750 BCE for Quintilet Ajrud. Crude graffiti in a cave at Khirbet Beit Lay in the Judean Shephelah have been read to refer to Yahweh, the divinity of all the earth, that's using the tetragrammaton, and to designate the specific deity as Elohei Yerushalayim, the divinity of Jerusalem. The god appears to be invoked as Yah El Hanan and Yahweh, although there's some debate about that latter one. Another inscription in the same cave states, "I am Yahweh your Elohim," a common phrase found in Deuteronomy. There is a three-chambered tomb with a central room inside the cave that likely was hewn sometime in the 8th to 7th century BCE and reused in the Persian period. So the inscriptions could date from either period and actually may not be connected to the funerary context at all if it was just used as a cave of refuge. An inscription from a two-chambered cave in the Judean desert near En-Gedi, dated on paleographic grounds to about 700 BCE, invokes Yahweh, and a few lines later seems to refer to this same deity by the title Adonai. One Idumean ostraca, which we're going to hear about later, from the late Persian period, mentions a Beit Yao, Yod He Vav, in a boundary description, alongside a Beit Uzzah. It is not clear, but maybe Benedict will have some ideas, if the temple was still functioning or was a ruined landmark at the time, and no further information concerning possible epithets of this form of Yahweh have surfaced. But maybe more will be coming. In the surviving Aramaic papyri excavated at the Judean military colony of Yhwh on the island of Elephantine, which we've also heard a lot about, the divine name, when used independently, always appears as Yah, never as Yahweh, as in the Hebrew Bible, as we have now learned quite a lot. And in the ostraca, we have also understood it is consistently written Yod He He. In addition to the two unmodified forms, we have Yod He He Tzevaot, which in 3 ostraca, also the expression the God of heaven, which appears numerous times, though only a few times directly preceded by Yah, Yod He Vav. In the earlier of 2 drafts of a letter to Begohi, the governor of Yhwh, Yah, the Lord of heaven, was written, before being amended to the more generic phrase, the God of heaven, in the second draft. Finally, the phrase, Yah, the God that dwells in the fortress of Yhwh, occurs once. I was not able to access the El Yehudu information, so that will be added later on if there's anything relevant there. The numerous fragments of dedicatory inscribed stones found scattered around Mount Gerizim and its slopes and associated with the temple complex in existence during the first half of the 2nd century, they've been dated to phase 2, but that can be disputed, refer generically in Aramaic to the God or the God in this place. 2 use the title Adonai. It can be noted that these uses overlap with those at Yhwh by employing the singular Eloah and Adonai and or Mara for Lord to refer to the deity, and both associate the deity with a particular location. The proper name Yahweh appears on only one preserved fragment, number 383. Uncharacteristically, this is again from Gerizim, it's written in Hebrew, as are words on a handful of other fragments. Now, I have not been able to see firsthand photographs to see how similar or dissimilar the handwriting may be. But it occurs to me, since there's so few of these, that it's quite possible they all once comprised a single dedicatory inscription. And if that is the case, I just wonder whether that may predate the Aramaic and Greek inscriptions from phase 2. Turning to the Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah, how many temples for the national gods, Yahweh Shomron and Yahweh Tzovaot, respectively, would have been established and maintained outside the capital cities? And what would have warranted the construction of additional temples or sanctuaries over time? The Hebrew Bible claims that King Jeroboam established national temples for Yahweh at Dan and Bethel. Most of you will know those citations. And yet, it never mentions the existence of a temple to Yahweh in the capital city of Samaria. Dan and Bethel are commonly understood to have been border sanctuaries. However, no other historical examples of this assumed practice have been cited from the ancient Near East. Typically, borders are fluid and meant to be temporary, since the goal of most rulers of an ancient territorial state or empire was to expand them. There seems to be a definite pro-Judean or possibly Judahite, anti-Samarian or possibly anti-Israelite strategy at work in the Book of Kings, meaning caution is needed in evaluating the historicity of the portrayed events. Was the Yahweh Shomron invoked in the inscription at Kuntilat Ajrud being conceived of as the god of the city of Samaria or the god of the territorial kingdom of Israel? The available extra-biblical evidence suggests that in the 8th century, the Assyrians tended to describe the kingdom in the central hill country of Cisjordan as though it were an Aramaean kingdom named after its dynastic founder, Omri. But they also were aware that the main seat of the kingdom was located in the city of Samaria. The small summary inscription of Sargon II talks of the plundering of Samarina and the entire land of Beit Omri, while his pavement inscription, 4, dated to 729, mentions the conquest of Samaria and the entire land of Beit Omri. Summary inscription 13 in particular states that only the city of Samaria was spared in what is often restored as the land of Beit Omri. I think in all these cases, Samaria or Samarina designated the city. Fairly soon after the territory of the former kingdom was converted to a provincial status, however, without a local dynastic family in control, the name of the former capital was chosen to designate the entire provincial unit. The city continued to function as the administrative seat of the Assyrian province. Thus, it is safe to conclude that in the inscription at Kuntilat Ajrud, which dates to about 800 BCE, Shomron is designating the city, not the kingdom of Israel or the land of the Omrides. This in turn also implies that the city hosted a temple dedicated to this deity at that point in time. Logically, it would have been constructed when the city was first founded by the Omrides alongside the palace complex. And logically, it should have remained in use through the conversion of the kingdom to an Assyrian and then Neo-Babylonian and then Persian province. As the long-established native god of the city, it would have been imprudent to forcefully close down its cult in favor of one honoring the gods of the new rulers or ethnic majority, and no such policy has been detected to have been enacted by the Achaemenid administration within its empire or by its predecessors either. At most, the Yahwistic temple in Samaria could have lost any tax-exempt status it might have enjoyed prior to the Persians becoming the new imperial rulers, requiring a segment of the local population that had remained in place to assume the cost of maintaining the cult, but that is only if its economy was not self-sufficient from its own investments and assets. So next section, the archaeological findings from excavations conducted at Gerizim and Shechem in the Persian period. So we'll start with Mount Gerizim. Excavations were conducted atop Mount Gerizim by Yitzhak Magain beginning in 1982 and intermittently until 2009, with additional salvage operations on the northern slope conducted in 219 to 221. So let's look at the Persian era sacred complex on Mount Gerizim. The excavators have uncovered a walled sacred precinct measuring some 96 meters from north to south and 98 meters from east to west, including the gates, built on bedrock. It contained an open-air altar whose location and physical structure has not been preserved. However, evidence of its existence is provided by a thick layer of bones of sheep, goats, cows, and pigeons and ash in a square building on the northeastern side of the precinct next to the northern gate. And similar deposits were also found in the southwestern corner of the fortified enclosure near the western staircase and in the inner southwest side of the enclosure. The courtyard of the ash-filled square building near the northern gate contained a cistern that would have been functioning during this phase of the complex's use. It is unclear if any of the other 6 or 7, depending on where you read in the reports, large cisterns excavated on the eastern side of the temple precincts were also in use in this phase, rather than being constructed in the Hellenistic or Byzantine period. But we have one, at least, from the Persian period. Whether this complex contained a temple building from the beginning or at any point during the Persian period is a matter of current debate. Magain argues the feature he has called the 12 stones provides likely evidence of a temple dating to the Persian period. The base layer of a wall or platform made of dressed stones measures 6.5 by 18 meters. A second layer seems to be in situ, most of which are not dressed, in the photograph at least. In his view, this stone feature could be the remains of the western wall of the original Holy of Holies of the first temple building. It stood inside the western enclosing wall of the sacred complex in phase 1, and in his view, but I can't quite understand the rationale, it was built before the precinct's western wall. He states this row of stones remains sacred to the Samaritan community to this day, even though it was only recently excavated. He also says they no longer believe a temple ever existed on Gerizim, in which case it is unlikely the Samaritans would have had a native tradition that considered the feature part of their first Persian-era temple. His argument would have been more persuasive had the feature been incorporated into the Hellenistic temple structure, which would have better marked and preserved its sanctity. Now, of course, the location of this latter Hellenistic temple building also remains uncertain, so that might have been the case. However, he has identified a building corner that lies slightly northeast of this feature to belong to that Hellenistic temple. So if he wants it to be the temple, then his thing stands outside. If he wants to give us a different boundary for where he would put the temple, possibly this could have been inside. Others, however, doubt the existence of a temple during the Persian period. R.T. Anderson and Yhwh have made that case, and on top of that, J.K. Zangenberg has suggested the 12 stones might have marked the site of the original altar, rather than being the rear wall of a temple. Now, an inscribed stone from a Sumerian synagogue on the island of Delos, which many of you will know, might indicate a temple existed at Gerizim by about 250 BCE, which was still during phase 1 of the complex, according to Magain's stratigraphy, even though it was after the end of the Persian imperial rule. It says, the Israelites who make first fruit offerings to the holy temple or sanctuary, the Mikdash, on Mount Gerizim, honor Menippos, son of Artemidorus of Heraklion, both himself and his descendants, for constructing and dedicating his own funds for the synagogue of God, and crown him with a golden crown, end quote, with some missing stuff in there. On paleographic grounds, the Greek inscription has been dated about 250 to 175, which includes the end of phase 1 and unfortunately the first 25 years of phase 2. So this inscription could testify to whatever this Heron is for either phase 1 or phase 2. So the central question for us to consider is what Hebrew or Aramaic term might underlie the word Heoron in this inscription, assuming it is a noun, as argued by R. Pummer, rather than an adjective. Is it Beit, which would clearly represent a temple, or Mikdash, which could be a temple building, but also could be an open-air sacred space with an altar only? Well, recognizing the ambiguous nature of the term in Greek, where the same two meanings are possible, Pummer opts for temple because of the reference to contributions being made. J. Dushek, on the other hand, opts for sanctuary, which would equate it more with the Hebrew term mikdash, which, as already noted, occurs in the third line of inscription 150 from Mount Gerizim, although this temple, this word would not exclude a temple building as an option. Inscription 150 is one of the rare fragments of a large dedicatory inscription written in Hebrew and believed to date to phase 2, or at least I think it was one large dedicatory inscription. It might, however, be a solitary dedicatory inscription composed at the time of the Persian era complex was inaugurated instead, similar to the one found at the temple of the old, as I understand, Patgeia at Ekron, but I've just been told that this is now being reread as Patneia. Possibly. Okay, at Ekron. So, but anyway, that inscription for the dedication of the temple, the inscription stone that we found there from the Iron 2B period. In this case, the governor or sponsoring patron of the facility would have commissioned its carving rather than the king of the city. And if the analogy holds, it would tend to suggest a temple building had been included in the complex. If the approximated date range for the Delos inscription is reliable, it could indicate a temple existed already before the end of the first phase of Gerizim. Even so, it would not confirm if it had been built when the sacred enclosure was first established or added secondarily as another feature of what had previously been an open-air sanctuary housing only an altar. Either way, the temple would have been constructed in phase 1, before the expansion of the site about 200 BCE, even if its location is no longer traceable. However, there's always a however. In trying to narrow the date range, Dushek has argued that the adjective holy that is found in this inscription, but not in a subsequent one referring to the same sanctuary on Har Gerizim, that's dated about 150 to 50 BCE, may designate a tax-exempt status instituted by the Seleucids for both the temple on Gerizim and the one in Jerusalem. If he is correct, then the reference could be to the temple on Gerizim constructed in phase 2, about 200 BCE. Its location is no longer certain either, due to the extensive clearing done to construct the Byzantine church complex. But in this latter case, this inscription could no longer be used as potential evidence for a Persian-era temple building. So we're sort of back to square one. This is very typical with a lot of our evidence. But another factor influencing this debate over the existence of a temple already in the Persian period is the date when residential areas were established outside the walls of the sacred complex. D. Regev has noted that Persian-era coins were found in situ in residential building 37 in area S, which is north of the phase 2 grand staircase leading to the eastern gate of the complex. Also in mansion complex 23, that included dwelling space, an oil press, and shops, and also in public building 25. The latter two are in area P, west of the western enclosing wall of the sacred complex. In addition, fragments of attic vessels were found in those same areas S and P, outside the walls of the sacred complex. The attic ware includes 4 fragments from at least 2, I'm not a Greek scholar, I don't know, lekithoi or lekithoi. Does anyone know how to pronounce that one? I'll just say lekithoi, okay. All had black slip and were glazed. Black glazed ware tended to succeed red figured ware toward the end of the 5th century BCE. Renewed salvage excavations conducted in 2019 to 21 on those northern slopes uncovered additional residential structures in Field 37 and areas B, C, D of Field 42 that date to the Persian period. They were constructed more or less on terraces whose retaining walls allowed fill to be added behind them to create a level surface for houses. Thus, it appears there were residential areas on the summit outside the walls of the sacred complex already in the Persian era, unlike what Magain was claiming, only after 200. This in turn might point to the presence of a temple building during the Persian period requiring full-time cultic personnel living adjacent to it to staff it and source its needs. Okay, final subsection here, a possible Iron Age sacred complex on Mount Gerizim. In spite of the historical conclusion offered by Magain that the earliest sacred precinct atop Gerizim was first built in the Persian period, and he dates that very tightly to about 480 to 475 BCE, independent evaluations of the material finds presented in publications to date have led Aaron Arya to the alternate proposal that the earliest sanctuary on the summit was first built in the Iron 2B or 2C period. Four main arguments have been offered in support of this view. They include the three-chambered gates giving access to the complex. This style of gate is not known to have been used in the southern Levant after the Iron 2B period. Now, curiously, when you look at the illustration of the Phase 1 complex in Magain's report, you don't see any three-chambered gates. You see all four-chambered gates, or 8 chambers if you have it on both sides. So was this an oversight, or is this an attempt to eliminate the troublesome dating of three-chambered gates to the Persian period? We need some consistency here. Second is the recovery of 3 so-called proto-Ionic or volute carved stone blocks that were reused in the eastern staircase leading to the sacred precinct that was built in stratum 6 and dated 200 to 110 BCE. Comparative data suggests they either should be dated to the 7th, 6th centuries BCE or to the Hellenistic period. Norma Franklin notes that the 3 carved volute blocks are unique among exemplars from the territory of Israel, in that, quote, their volutes protrude beyond their narrow bases, making them, in effect, hanging volutes. To my mind, the most logical functional explanation would be that they were secured because they're relatively thin and narrow, but with these little sort of side ear things hanging off. They were secured to a solid facade to top engaged square columns, either carved to protrude from a stone facade or attached secondarily to a stone facade of a building, like the volute blocks. Since they were not found in C2 in the complex, but in secondary use in the staircase on the eastern slope, they most logically belonged originally to either the Persian sacred precinct or to a preceding late Iron Age building or complex on the summit. Third, 15 pottery forms excavated within the sacred precinct have Iron 2C parallels from coastal sites that Magain did not use in his comparison for the pottery and therefore the dating of the pottery. Finally, Arya has noted that 2 of the 11 carbon-14 samples have dates that are significantly earlier than the other 9. One has a calibrated date of 760 to 390 BCE, and the second 810 to 540 BCE. So in light of the other evidence, they might belong to the Iron Age phase of use. Although I have to mention that Dalit Regeb mentioned to me very recently, she's been doing a lot of DNA analysis on Phoenician bodies, and they're getting a lot of mismatches between the carbon-14 dates of the bone samples they're taking, mainly from tombs, and the associated pottery. And she's been talking to other people who have similar mismatches with carbon-14 and the pottery sequencing. So there is something, one has to take the carbon-14 datings a little bit with a grain of salt, and no one has yet figured out what is influencing this out of kilter thing. Something has to be affecting the breakdown rate on the carbon-14 to give these readings that don't correspond at all. Okay. With a proposed new date between 650 to 550 BCE for the building of an Iron Age complex on Gerizim, Arya concludes its function would have been cultic, not secular, and sets out three possible contexts for its construction. The earliest would have taken place around 650, quote, as an independent center for the new population brought in by the Assyrians. The second date would be about 600 after King Josiah's reform and the alleged dismantling of the temple at Bethel, a site already in decline according to a fresh examination of the pottery, which was mentioned by Israel Finkelstein, because he did it. The third would be after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 in order to fill the cultic gap following the annihilation of the temple. Now, Arya rejects this third context, the post-586, as improbable because it does not explain why such a complex would be erected at a new site with no prior cultic connection. That same objection would apply also to the second option, even though he does not actually acknowledge that. On the other hand, however, his observation would be logical in the context of his first option, around 650, particularly if the new temple would have been dedicated to one or more non-native deities of a new population group settled in the area. A virgin site makes sense in that context, and the sanctuary of the Oak of Moreh, referenced as outside Shechem but seemingly in the valley and not on Eval or Gerizim, might have been a long-standing Shechemite or Israelite sacred place dedicated to some form of Yahweh and possibly Asherah. In Arya's thought, the second and third options presume that cultic centralization had gone into effect in both Samaria and Judah or Yhwh, which is questionable. Part of his reason for favoring the interpretation of the Iron Age complex as a sacred precinct is what he perceives to be an inability to understand, quote, where the main cultic center of Samaria was during the Babylonian period, and why the Persian Empire granted permission to build a temple in a new place with almost no cultic tradition, as opposed to their ordinary religious policy. I'm not quite sure what he thinks that policy is, but okay. He and others have overlooked the strong historical likelihood that a Yahwistic temple would have existed in the capital city of Samaria. During the time of the Israelite kings, it would have continued under the Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. There is no reason to assume that there had only been 3 temples to Yahweh in the kingdom of Israel during its existence, that is, at Samaria, Bethel, and Dan. Others, no doubt, continued in use well after 721, now supported by local initiatives, unless they were self-supporting. When working at the capital in Samaria, the governor would have been a patron of the long-standing temple to Yahweh of Samaria. So the final issue that needs addressing is whether the likely Iron Age complex that was apparently on Mount Gerizim had been a sacred precinct or something else. The possibility needs to be considered that the evidence that was cited by Arya could have come from the summer residence of an Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian governor or official, built using local conventions and imagery. Engaged columns crowned by attached volute blocks could have flanked one or more external or internal entryways, or could have been spaced at intervals around the main facade or internally in the main reception hall. Now, having said that, a biblical scholar, a Hebrew Bible scholar, can't but overlook the coincidence that both options recall decorative elements in descriptions of Solomon's temple, which may be an amalgam of features of the Jerusalemite temple in different periods. So the first, the volute capitals recall Yachin and Boaz in a general way, and then the other possibility, since we have 3 of these, we also have in the temple description the palm decorations that were to have adorned the interior walls of the temple as well as the doors in the various chambers alongside cherubim and opening blossoms, which is in Kings, or if you look at the Chronicles version, the walls of the nave alongside chains, palms with chains. Palm trees are depicted to flank the entrance to Iron Age ceramic shrines, for example, from Tel Rehov and Pella, and certainly were not associated with Yahweh alone by any means. It also is likely any governor's residence would have had a chamber set aside for use as a shrine. So whether one concludes that a sacred precinct or a monumental building, possibly with a small shrine in one of its rooms, was built atop Gerizim at some point in the Iron IIc period, the scant evidence currently available does not preclude a period of abandonment before its reuse, once again in the Persian period, as a sacred complex or a repurposing to serve this function, depending on whether we had a temple there or not. And the reason I might suggest this is a 75-year occupational gap has been detected at nearby Shechem at the foot of Gerizim, between stratum 6 from the Iron IIc period and stratum 5, the Persian period, which might make that an option. Would there have been enough of a regional population in this gap period to support a pre-existing precinct or temple otherwise? Would memory of a former temple or possible shrine within a villa complex have been perpetuated? Would the Persian era builders have felt comfortable dismantling that former temple or palatial complex that had also contained a shrine, possibly, and rededicating the space to a form of Yahweh, who may not have been the god worshipped there originally? If so, they likely reused the stones to build new walls or structures inside or outside what now became the Persian era sacred complex. Did the Phase II builders of the western staircase dismantle some Persian walls that already had reused the volute stones and place them in tertiary use? The intriguing combination of evidence that seems to point to some sort of activity on the summit in the late Bronze Age raises crucially important issues. I'm going to leave those open. So we're going to move on to Shechem in the Persian period. Excavations were conducted at Tel Balata between 1913 and 1934 by an Austro-German team led by Ernst Zellen, and again 1956 to 1973 by the Drew McCormick Archaeological Expedition, which later became the Joint Expedition. In the final report, stratum 5, covering the Persian era occupation, has been dated about 525 to 475 BCE, so a pretty short 50-year period. Almost no architectural remains have been recovered from stratum 5 due to the extensive leveling, salvaging of stones for reuse, and filling during the Hellenistic period over the entire site, which is represented by phases 4, 3, and 2. Okay. No specific building structures have been identified with stratum 4, only a few floor fragments and tanurs, ovens. However, sherds from the full range of domestic pottery in use in stratum 5, including storage jars, jugs, juglets, bowls, craters, mortaria, cooking pots, and lamps, were recovered from the fills in fields 7 and 9 that were laid down to level the site by the Hellenistic builders after about a 150-odd year period of abandonment. So the Persian era is preceded by 75-year abandonment allegedly, and then has a 150-year after it before we get Hellenistic. In addition, 158 sherds of early attic ware have been recovered from fills or later Hellenistic constructions in fields 7 and 9. All examples date to the period about 525 to 475 BCE. They include examples of the black-figured and ensuing red-figured style or technique. The sherds come from a minimum of 4 craters, 3 cups, and several lakithoi. The craters and cups were standard elements of drinking sets used in Greece for symposia. The lakithoi vases contained perfume oil that traditionally was smeared on the skin of a woman about to be married. In Greece, they often were placed in the tombs of unmarried women. The presence of Attic ware at the site need not indicate resident Greeks. Rather, it is likely to signal the presence of an elite element able to acquire exotic foreign goods, such as these. Shechem lay along an internal road system that would have allowed such goods to arrive relatively easily. In such a case, it is unknown whether the locals would have known how the items would have been used in Greek culture and would have adopted those customs, or would have used them however they found helpful. This might have included drinking mixed wine when entertaining, but not in the context of a symposium explicitly, and softening and perfuming the skin of live bodies, male or female. The limited time range represented by the small number of attic pieces might signal the lifespan of one or more influential families living at Shechem, with access to trade connections that could supply such goods more than the actual dates of the occupation of Stratum 5. Two more significant finds turned up in the fill that likely relate to Persian-era occupation of Shechem in Stratum 5 are, first, a jar handle stamped with the imprint of a stylized lion. These stamps are known from various sites within the territory of Yhwh and have been associated with the Persian period there. Unless more such stamps turn up in the province of Samaria with some regularity, suggesting this stamp marked an imperially authorized product, unit of measure, or material from an imperial estate that would have been used in adjoining provinces, it would appear that a person of prominence traveled from Yhwh to Shechem with food or drink supplies for use while there. It has been suggested the jar contained wine. The second is an official Persian seal impression on a dab of clay once attached to a papyrus document. The underside of the clay bulla has the impression marks of the former document it sealed. The image on top features a Persian archer facing left with a deity symbol behind and above it to the left. Official Persian coins, so-called derricks, featured a series of archers as their main imagery as well, which was adopted and applied to other coinage minted in the empire. This find is quite significant. It suggests Shechem was home to someone connected with the imperial Achaemenid administration. The other finds of note include 18 examples of stamped jar handles bearing the same imprint that have only been found to date at Shechem. They have been assigned to Stratum 5 only through a process of elimination, however, but so it's sort of unconfirmed whether they truly are Persian period or not. None, of course, were found in a tightly stratified context. If they are Persian in date, they might have contained wine produced at a local estate. The ceramic finds on Gerizim overlap extensively with those from Shechem 5 and Shechem, except fragments of basins appear to have been missing from Shechem. Craters, with wedge and stamped circle decoration occur in both locations, but also are known from other sites. The presence of attic ware from both is noticeable, although the description of the 4 pieces of attic ware from Gerizim do not specify if any belong to the early black or red figured tradition. Also, the presence of an early Cypriot coin dated about 480 outside the precinct on Gerizim is close in date to the coin from Thassos from the fill in Shechem. Yet the Persian-era coins from Mount Gerizim showed it continued to be used throughout the end of the 5th century and into the 4th century until Alexander's conquest in the beginning of the ensuing Ptolemaic period, unlike the 150-year abandonment after the end of the Persian occupation at Shechem. Now, Adam Zertal's survey of the Manasseh of the territory of Manasseh identified 17 Persian-era settlements on the slopes of Yhwh versus 1 in the preceding Iron IIc period and 12 in the Hellenistic period. In addition, there were 5 more Persian-era sites east of Shechem, with none in the preceding period and 3 in the Hellenistic period. This encounters the larger trends in the province, where settlement peaked in the Hellenistic period, although in the vicinity of the city of Samaria, you also had a peak in the Persian era. So, final section, evaluating Sanballat's possible establishment of the cult of Yahweh on Mount Gerizim, which will probably interest most of you more than all of the other stuff. So time precludes a rehearsal of the many possible scenarios for understanding which form of Yahweh was honored on Gerizim in the Persian period and whether or not it was a carryover from the preceding Iron 2B period. This latter possibility will be set aside for the time being. In light of Josephus' claim that Sanballat built the temple for his Yhwhite son-in-law Manasseh, I will focus on evaluating the plausibility of the historical involvement of this key individual, recognizing that plausibility does not guarantee factuality. Sanballat's origins are uncertain. The epithet applied to him in the Hebrew Bible, which seems to indicate a place of origin, has been variously understood. Those who accept the MT pointing Horonite tend to associate him either with Upper or Lower Beit Horon in the southwestern Ephraimite hill country on the road from Jerusalem to Joppa, or with the site of Khirbet el Huara, 4.5 miles south of Shechem on the road to Ramallah and Jerusalem. Those who opt instead to revocalize it tend to consider his place of origin the Syrian city of Haran, where the cult of sin was prominent, explaining the deity invoked in his name. Had he been born in the province of Samaria, his ancestry might have traced back to settlers introduced after 721 via forced migrations from a region honoring the deity Sin, who had remained an influential family god for some 175 years. Is it coincidental that the city of Haran in Syria features prominently in the origin stories of Abraham and Jacob? The current MT pointing may be an attempt to disassociate the vilified figure of Sanballat from the two illustrious patriarchs. However, if such a link had been intentional, then it opens a number of intriguing avenues to explore. The Jacob cycle, which features a foundational story for Bethel, also claims family ties to Haran for Israel's immediate founding father. In canonical Genesis, Abraham comes to represent both the Judean diaspora community via his origin in Ur of the Chaldees and the Israelite Samarian diaspora community via his temporary new home in Haran. There is ambiguity in the location, There is ambiguity in the location of Abraham's first encounter with Yahweh, where he is told to leave behind his homeland, immediate family, and clan. While the initial impression is it took place in Haran, logic leads one ultimately to conclude it took place in Ur. As a result, Terah's leaving Ur with Abraham and Sarai and taking his grandson Lot as well, as though he were in charge of family decisions, and his subsequent decision to put down roots in Haran and not continue to Canaan, leads Abraham's first failure to obey a divine command. But was Haran ever involved in the earliest storyline? Or was it introduced in order to interweave an older version of the Jacob cycle with an older version of the Abraham cycle? And either way, was it chosen because it was Sanballat's place of origin? Allowing an allusion to one of the potential patrons of the development of the Pentateuch and potential sponsor of the Gerizim temple for Yahweh Elohim. Gary Knoppers argued, it is much more likely that the religious or at least scribal communities of Samaria and Yhwh both possessed and valued the Pentateuch than that one borrowed it from the other wholesale. The relatively few sectarian changes date to the late 2nd or 1st century, while the bulk is shared in common. When I read this through, I had it down to 45 minutes, but I'm just so tired. As a joint venture between scribes from both Yahwistic provinces, it is possible it could have been implemented in the existing temple to Yahweh in Samaria. If so, the complex on Gerizim could have been dedicated to Yahweh of Shomron and modeled on the Iron Age complex in Samaria, explaining the three-chambered gate and the carved stone volutes. This could have been an extension of this deity's cult to the new site. On the other hand, the introduction of a new collection of writings might have been resisted by the long-standing priesthood at the temple of Yahweh in Samaria. If so, then the sacred complex on Gerizim would have been established as a rival to the older sanctuary to Yahweh in Samaria. It would have been meant to implement a new form of Yahweh, shared in principle with the Persian-era temple in Jerusalem. This would be the henotheistic conceptualization expressed in the book of Deuteronomy, in particular, Yahweh ha-Elohim, or Yahweh Elohim. In both cases, if Sanballat had been governor at the time and had secured permission to establish the temple, guaranteeing its local non-imperial funding, he would have been able to appoint its priesthood as well. This could have included his own sons, or possibly a Yhwhite son-in-law and grandson of the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem, as Josephus relates, elaborating on Nehemiah 13:28. I don't think that I can, we'll just stop right there.
Thank you. I found your interpretation of Yahweh Shomron in Kuntilet Atrun as referring to the city instead of the land plausible. Of course, this presupposes then a sanctuary in Samaria in some capacity. In the Bible, in 1 Kings 16, King Ahab is being mentioned to having established a temple and an altar for Ahab in Samaria. How would you interpret somehow this mention in relation to Yahweh's Shomron in Kuntilet Atrut? Is this just a misnomer for a Yahweh temple that was somehow villainified by the Deuteronomists, or what would your evaluation be there?
Okay, so the Deuteronomists had it in for a number of sanctuaries. One of them is Gibeon. It hardly ever mentions Gibeon, but then in Chronicles we learn that there was like a kingdom, a temple of the kingdom at Gibeon. I think similarly, they chose not to acknowledge the fact that there had been this temple of Yahweh in Samaria for whatever reason. It goes to Dan and Bethel instead. You can't have a capital of the kingdom, a king, a dynasty always will have a temple nearby for the deity that is the dynastic supporter. So there had to have been, and I'm not the only person who's noted this. Nadav Naaman has said it, Schwartz said it as well. I mean, it's logical that there had to have been a temple there. So we're dealing more with polemics of some sort, or silence somehow gets rid of it by ignoring it. That's all I would say.
But we have one question here. Just
Yeah.
a final question.
Well,
I will have just two very short notes. One is that after many visits in the site, including with excavators and reviewing all the publications, I was convinced that there is a nice Persian period temple in Gerizim. But I'm saying it only because I want to have another note, and this is when we discussed yesterday the temple in Jerusalem, the very poor city or village around it with priests, and then we spoke about the production of the text in this very poor place, people jumped. But think about the very small temple in Gerizim with a very small village around it with some priests. They produce the same amount of text. They had the same thing.
Exactly.
So in the Persian period, we have small villages around temples. And these villages with small temples produced the text that we are dealing with until today.
Yeah,
So
the scribes
this
are
is something
supposed
to remember.